All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. We're gonna do Pragmatism and Richard Rorty part 2 today, and Chief Keefe, of course, is back for that. And I asked you beforehand so I could add them to the title. I think you said some of the topics we're gonna go over in terms of Richard Rorty's thoughts on them are relativism, Heidegger, Dewey, and Derrida, all very interesting thinkers slash topics. So, do you want to do your intro to I guess Rorty, usually some background information, and then Rorty's thoughts on those as you usually do there, Tim?
Right. So we're going to continue with Richard Rorty, who is the best known American philosopher within the past, I'd say 50 years or so, definitely late 20th century. And he was a member of what's called neo-pragmatism, which in the first episode, actually the very first episode, we had covered about what pragmatism is and a very quick overview of Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. But then Rorty took up the mantle again because pragmatism, after Dewey's time, kind of fell out of favor, specifically after the Second World War, when things moved towards the analytic take with the emigres that were coming from Europe, particularly Rudolf Carnap, who was active at the University of Chicago, definitely influenced Willard Quine. And analytic philosophy has still been around with us. But Rorty, he started off as an analytic philosopher, and then he sort of rediscovered pragmatism and was a huge proponent of it starting around the 70s or so and going into the 80s. And so that's why they consider him a neo-pragmatist, but he certainly was not a very strong adherent to people like Peirce. James, he was a little more sympathetic to, but John Dewey was definitely his intellectual hero.
Okay. I didn't realize that pragmatism went out of favor for how long of a period of time was that?
Oh, for many years.
Okay.
Another good guy contemporarily that is interesting to read is John Kaag, Kaag, who a few years ago wrote Hiking with Nietzsche.
Oh, okay.
But what was it, last year, I think, came out? It was it was sort of a memoir in a way, American Philosophy, a Love Story. And this year is going to be a book on James, William James.
Oh, cool. I bet Hayden will be excited for that.
Oh, I'm sure he's already got an advanced copy there.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so pragmatism is something unique to American philosophy, but yeah, it just, it was, as we covered in the very first episode, it was sort of an outgrowth from transcendentalism, from Emerson, Thoreau, and then it lasted until, about the Second World War. And then you had the shift to analytic philosophy, and so it just kind of fell out of favor. Didn't mean that it didn't influence some figures that were, what we consider the classic mainstream analytic philosophers such as Quine and Davidson. They very much were influenced to a certain extent by pragmatism, but you didn't really hear too much about Peirce, James, and Dewey until sometime starting around the 50s or 60s again. Sort of a resurgence there. And then Rorty, again, as I said, with how they classify him as the neo-pragmatism, he put it more on the map, resurrected it in a way.
Okay. And transcendentalism in relation to Kant's transcendental categories as well, or
no.
not?
This is something very different.
Totally different. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. I'm not going to go into Emerson. People could look up to see what Emerson's take on things was, but more of the spiritual realm, something that was not so organized religion approach. Again, you guys can go look it up. I'm not going to go too far down this rabbit hole. Okay. So last episode, we started to get more into Rorty, particularly with his magnum opus, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. So the quick summary with that is he was propounding the thesis that for a long, long time, Western philosophy was about, and this is where the title comes from, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. So we have nature, the world that is out there. We have this thing that we call a mind. And the task of philosophy is to show how the mind accurately reflects, this is where the mirror metaphor comes in, accurately reflects what is going on in the world out there. So consequently, it had a very strong epistemological focus. The theory of knowledge, how is it that we come to know things as we know them? Foundationalism is there's an Archimedes point from which all knowledge springs instead of a coherentist approach, which there's a web of beliefs that all kind of hang together. And
we were actually going over foundationalism in terms of Plato in our philosophy class yesterday.
So there you go. Yeah. Stretching as far back as Plato.
Yeah.
The unchangeable, indestructible, immaterial forms, otherworldly forms, transcendent forms.
Yeah.
And so on. Yeah, so you had epistemological and foundationalism. That's what Western philosophy has more or less been for the past couple hundred years. And by resurrecting pragmatism, Rorty is taking a different tack. He's saying that we should avoid this because it has clearly gotten us into problems, led us down cul-de-sacs from which we cannot escape, and that we're rehashing the same problems again and again. Whereas it is much better if we just avoid this altogether and take a different approach. So that's his magnum opus. Now, what we're going to cover tonight is another book, which is a collection of essays, Consequences of Pragmatism, 1972 to 1980. So the dates are key. We'll hold those in mind, 72 to 1980. And Consequences is, these are the essays that he collected, but they appeared in journals elsewhere, showing the resurrecting and then redeploying pragmatism. This is his take on how pragmatism fleshes itself out in the late 20th century. Okay.
Okay.
So with that out of the way, let's go ahead to the book itself. And we're not going to cover all of the essays here. I'm going to jump around a little bit too, but there are just a handful that I really wanted to focus on here. And we'll start with the introduction. So this is Pragmatism and Philosophy. This is page 13 in the introduction of Consequences of Pragmatism. So Rorty starts, he says, "The essays in this book are attempts to draw consequences from a pragmatist theory about truth. This theory says that truth is not the sort of thing one should expect to have a philosophically interesting theory about. For pragmatists, truth is just the name of a property which all true statements share." Let me read this again. For pragmatists, truth is just the name of a property which all true statements share. It is what is common to Bacon did not write Shakespeare. It rained yesterday. E equals MC squared. Love is better than hate. The allegory of painting was Vermeer's best work. 2 plus 2 is 4. And there are non-denumerable infinities. Pragmatists doubt that there is much to be said about this common feature. They doubt this for the same reason they doubt that there is much to be said about the common feature shared by such morally praiseworthy actions as Susan leaving her husband, America joining the war against the Nazis, America pulling out of Vietnam, Socrates not escaping from jail, Roger picking up litter from the trail, and the suicide of the Jews in Masada. They see certain acts as good ones to perform under the circumstances, but doubt that there is anything general and useful to say about what makes them all good. The assertion of a given sentence, or the adoption of a disposition to assert the sentence, the conscious acquisition of a belief, is a justifiable, praiseworthy act in certain circumstances, but all the more strongly, it is not likely that there is something general and useful to be said about what makes all such actions good, about the common feature of all the sentences which one should acquire a disposition to assert. Okay. So he is mentioning the pragmatist theory of truth, which we had seen before as, to use James's definitions, it's what works. Okay. Another way that you could frame about truth is It is useful to the circumstances. So, the statements, the propositions that he gave in the first part of the paragraph, these are pretty much true. We would say they're true, and they are certainly true in the circumstances. However, what Rorty is trying to say is that there is nothing inherent essentialist, because pragmatists are non-essentialists here, about what makes them all true, something that is internal to them that makes them true. We just kind of know they're true, and it's a property that all true statements have, but nothing that you can provide theoretically, indubitably, that makes them true.
Right.
Okay.
So they're not essentialist truths, and it sounds like he's also saying that it's not even necessarily that useful to figure out what absolute truths are.
No, that's not.
Right. Okay.
Right. Okay.
I appreciate that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then in the next page, he continues saying, pragmatists think that the history of attempts to isolate the true, capital T, or the good, capital G, or to define the word true or good, supports their suspicion that there is no interesting work to be done in this area. It might, of course, have turned out otherwise. People have, oddly enough, found something interesting to say about the essence of force and the definition of number. They might have found something interesting to say about the essence of truth, capital T, but in fact they haven't. The history of attempts to do so, and of criticisms of such attempts, is roughly coextensive with the history of that literary genre we call philosophy, a genre founded by Plato. Note the term genre. So pragmatists see the Platonic tradition as having outlived its usefulness. This does not mean that they have a new, non-Platonic set of answers to Platonic questions to offer, but rather that they do not think we should ask those questions anymore. When they suggest that we not ask questions about the nature of truth or goodness, they do not invoke a theory about the nature of reality or knowledge, or man, which says that there is no such thing as truth or goodness, nor do they have a relativistic or subjectivist theory of truth or goodness. They would simply like to change the subject.
Ah, okay. That's
Okay.
kind of like it kind of reminds me a little bit of Heidegger in that asking, I forget what it was exactly. It was something, was it about metaphysics that asked it, he was saying rather than going into metaphysics, he was asking the question of what it is to ask what metaphysics is.
Right. So we'll get to this in the one essay, Heidegger and Derrida, and Dewey. So Rorty did have an affection for Heidegger. Why? It's because Heidegger, as you had mentioned, was one of those that was trying to deconstruct the history of Western metaphysics. So, like Rorty had said in the Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, there definitely was an epistemological turn. Heidegger also focused on that to a certain extent. But there still was this preoccupation with metaphysics, that we have to get the theory right of what is behind that. So if we're talking about truth, which Rich Rorty has also talked about here, pragmatists are not so concerned about what makes truth truth. Where does truth reside? Does it reside in an otherworldly realm? In a Platonic realm? Is it within language? Is it something else? Okay, so they just don't ask this question, and particularly Rorty isn't interested in asking these questions either. Okay, it's kind of I don't want to necessarily say it's a commonsensical approach to things, because if you ask the average person in the street, well, how would you define truth? They might give you a correspondence theory answer, or they might just say, well, I don't know, I don't care, it's just true to me.
Right.
Type of thing. They're not even preoccupied with what a theory of truth is, unlike philosophers. Now, Rorty, using the term genre, he'll get to this later, particularly with the Derrida essay, is that, is philosophy a kind of writing? Is it a kind of literary genre? Well, interesting question. This is what the early Derrida, and again, what I said to mention, focusing on the title of the book, 72 1980, this is around the time that Derrida really started to emerge on the scene. The early Derrida, from the days of dissemination, writing indifference, of grammatology, all the key early works, not the later works.
And in terms of Derrida, those post-structuralist thinkers like him and Foucault, that term deconstruction that you used was, I think it was coined by them, right? Or at least they did that a lot, which you mentioned that Heidegger was doing with metaphysics.
Right. Deconstruction is most closely associated with Derrida, who in turn took it from Heidegger. So the German term is Destruktion, which is not destruction. It is deconstruction, sort of a taking apart to look at. Derrida was very much influenced by Heidegger early on in his career.
Not so much later?
No, not so much later. He because through deconstruction, the purpose of deconstruction was to try to get at the contradictions and the assumptions that were already implicit in the philosopher's work. So although Heidegger was very much against the tradition, he himself was part of that tradition.
Okay.
So continuing, Rorty says, uncapitalized truth and goodness name properties of sentences or of actions and situations. Capitalized, they are the proper names of objects, goals or standards which can be loved with all one's heart and soul and mind, objects of ultimate concern. Similarly, philosophy can mean simply what Sellers, this is Wilfrid Sellers, calls, quote, an attempt to see how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. So
that seems like the broadest possible definition of the term.
Yes. So again, Sellers says it's an attempt to see how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term.
Right.
Okay. Coincidentally, Sellers influenced Rorty a great deal too, earlier on in his career.
Okay.
Okay. So then continuing, Rorty says, I shall capitalize the term philosophy when used in this second sense, in order to help make the point that philosophy, truth, goodness, and rationality, all capitalized, are interlocked Platonic notions. Pragmatists are saying that the best hope for philosophy is not to practice philosophy with a capital P. They think it will not help to say something true, to think about truth, capital T. Nor will it help to act well to think about goodness, capital G. Nor will it help to be rational to think about rationality, capital R.
Yeah, those are all really good points.
Yes. Okay. So then he continues. So far, however, my description of pragmatism has left an important distinction out of account. Within philosophy, capital P, there has been a traditional difference of opinion about the nature of truth, a battle between, as Plato put it, the gods and the giants. On the one hand, there have been philosophers like Plato himself who were otherworldly, possessed of a larger hope. They urged that human beings were entitled to self-respect only because they had one foot beyond space and time. On the other hand, especially since Galileo showed how spatio-temporal events could be brought under the sort of elegant mathematical law, which Plato suspected might hold only for another world, there have been philosophers, for example Hobbes and Marx, who insisted that space and time make up the only reality, capital R, there is, and that truth is correspondence to that reality.
I used to believe that.
Yeah. Well, lots of people commonsensically believe this too. What is true? It's correspondence to reality.
Yep.
Because they're not thinking like philosophers.
Yeah. That's a little like in my philosophy class yesterday when we were talking about Plato's theories of knowledge and the skeptical claims against them as well. One of the students said something to the effect of, like, why should we even care? It doesn't. Why do we even talk about this stuff? And I was saying something like, well, it depends on what you think philosophy is for. It depends on whether you go with more of a pragmatist interpretation of truth, or a pragmatist interpretation of what philosophy should be for, rather. Or if you think that philosophy is good for intellectual masturbation, which good or both are good purposes, depending on what you're looking for.
So I have a funny story to tell, piggybacking on that. In my very first philosophy class, which I think I've mentioned before, this is many years ago. It was a small class. I'd say probably 7 students. And I was at a Baptist college in Kentucky. That's a separate story. So I enjoyed that philosophy class, and I still have the textbook. That was my very first textbook. But when you mentioned about, well, why should we even care? I remember that there was this one girl there who kind of asked the same questions. And what was funny is that this person easily poo-poos philosophy. Why should we even care? You know, what good does this do us? And yet you're at a Baptist college who take at face value Baptist Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I always remember that.
Yeah.
And I still laugh whenever I think about it.
Yeah. Well, because we all have like the sort of default settings of looking at these things based on our upbringing and where we end up going to school, and that's one of the good things about philosophy, that it can challenge you to question in those beliefs.
Yeah, I also think it's due to the person too. You know,
Yeah.
I took to it like a fish took to water, but that's just me. Other people, they don't care.
Yeah.
Even if you just show, yeah, you know, it's like sharpening on iron. It's really going to help you see where questioning your presuppositions and preventing you from being hoodwinked by politicians. No, don't care.
Yeah. That in particular, like it can really help enhance your critical thinking skills, so it can help you more easily detect when people are just speaking in platitudes.
Nope, don't care.
Exactly.
Some people just don't care.
Yeah.
But we do, and that's why we're doing this.
Yeah.
Okay, so then Rorty continues on the next page. He says, it is important to realize that the empirical philosophers, the positivists, were still doing philosophy with a capital P. The Platonic presupposition which unites the gods and the giants, Plato with Democritus, Kant with Mill, Husserl with Russell, is what the vulgar call truth. The assemblage of true statements should be thought of as divided into a lower and an upper division, a division between, in Plato's terms, mere opinion and genuine knowledge, or to use the Greek terms, doxa versus episteme. Okay?
Yeah.
Then he continues, pragmatism cuts across this transcendental empirical distinction by questioning the common presupposition that there is an invidious distinction to be drawn between kinds of truths. For the pragmatist, true sentences are not true because they correspond to reality, and so there is no need to worry about what sort of reality, if any, a given sentence corresponds to. No need to worry about what makes it true. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So this is doing away with the correspondence theory. And then he continues, one difficulty the pragmatist has in making his position clear, therefore, is that he must struggle with the positivist for the position of radical anti-Platonist. He wants to attack Plato with different weapons from those of the positivist, but at first glance he looks just like another variety of positivist. Okay, so just briefly, the positivists were concerned about using scientific method, or what was coming out in the 19th century for science, as a means to get at proper correspondence, truth, reality, whatever it was, because philosophy was doing a bad job of it.
Mm-hmm.
Or that philosophy really ran up against its own limits and then science was going to take over. Okay,
Yeah.
This is the hallmarks of positivism. Fast forwarding a couple decades going into the 20th century, you had the logical positivists who were within the same vein, but then they were applying stuff like logic, and then eventually the turn to language is that metaphysics was just a bunch of language games, and this was part of the problem. This is what, in large part, what Carnap's project was, to do away with metaphysics because it was a language thing. And then later on, it's ordinary language, focusing on what about meanings and how does one use language to shape the world and so on and so forth. Okay. So then Rorty was saying is that the positivists were still practicing philosophy with a capital P, meaning they were trying to get at the proper method, the proper way of looking at the world, the proper armature and the equipment in place to really get at how are we going to describe reality accurately and how is language going to hang together and correspond to reality, unlike philosophy did.
Right.
Okay. So then, as he says in the last paragraph, that to the casual observer, what makes a pragmatist different from a positivist? And this is what he's trying to avoid.
Well, I would say that one chief difference between pragmatists and logical positivists is that they don't necessarily place science as being the be-all, end-all, most important thing in the same way that logical positivists do.
Well, I would disagree. Why?
Oh,
It's
really?
because of Peirce. Okay.
Oh, Peirce, yeah.
So remember what I had said before about Peirce. Peirce was a scientist first and foremost. And he coined the term pragmatism, but then he changed it to pragmaticism to distinguish himself from James. Okay.
Right.
So Peirce was still a scientist. Was he a positivist? No, I would disagree with that. What, again, Rorty is trying to do here is how does one distinguish a pragmatist from a positivist? If we say that both the pragmatist and the positivist do not care about philosophy with capital P, then they seem to be indistinguishable on the surface. But he says no, because the positivists are still practicing philosophy with a capital P. Pragmatists are not. Now remember, as we're going through these essays, not just these, but later essays, is that Rorty is fleshing out his own version of what pragmatism is, with a particular emphasis on Dewey.
Right.
Okay. Rorty really didn't have that much of an interest in Peirce. It was mostly James and Dewey. Just to get that clear.
Okay.
Okay. So then he continues. Same in the introduction. So he says, among contemporary philosophers, pragmatism is usually regarded as an outdated philosophical movement, one which flourished in the early years of this century, meaning the 20th, in a rather provincial atmosphere, that is, New England, and which has now been either refuted or overcome. Okay?
Okay.
So I touched on this before. Skipping around a bit, going to the next section. He's talking about analytic philosophy, and he says, I think that analytic philosophy culminates in Quine, the later Wittgenstein, Sellers, and Donald Davidson, which is to say that it transcends and cancels itself. These thinkers successfully and rightly blur the positivist distinctions between the semantic and the pragmatic, the analytic and the synthetic, the linguistic and the empirical, theory and observation. Davidson's attack on the scheme-content distinction, in particular, summarizes and synthesizes Wittgenstein's mockery of his own Tractatus, Quine's criticisms of Carnap, and Sellers' attack on the empiricist myth of the given. Davidson's holism and coherentism shows how language looks once we get rid of the central presupposition of philosophy, capital P, that true sentences divide into an upper and a lower division. The sentences which correspond to something and those which are true only by courtesy or convention. So, Rorty was very much influenced by Davidson because Davidson took a more or less semantic version of truth. Instead of the correspondence theory of truth, which is a hallmark of, kind of the history of philosophy, and then taking a coherentist view, which is a web of beliefs that they all hang together, self-justifying one another, is that to really talk about truth is only to talk about its property within language.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's very that's kind of a isn't that also a commonality within Derrida, sort of?
No, I would not say that.
No?
No,
Okay.
because Derrida is not interested in truth either.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
I thought
get
that I'd remembered reading something about him looking at like language. Maybe it's just in terms of his thoughts about language. Maybe I'm thinking just about his language, but he doesn't actually relate it to truth. Yeah, that's probably it. Because he talks about sort of the subjectivity of language, but I guess he probably doesn't apply that to truth in that way.
No, he doesn't. We'll see that later on in Rorty's essay on Derrida.
Right.
Okay, so then continuing on, Rorty says, the pragmaticization of analytic philosophy gratified the logical positivists' hopes, but not in the fashion which they had envisioned. It did not find a way for philosophy to become scientific, but rather found a way of setting philosophy to one side. This post-positivistic kind of analytic philosophy thus comes to resemble the Nietzsche-Heidegger-Derrida tradition, in beginning with criticism of Platonism and ending in criticism of philosophy as such. Both traditions are now in a period of doubt about their own status. Both are living between a repudiated past and the dimly seen post-philosophical future. So again, when Rorty is writing these essays, these are in the 70s, where analytic philosophy was starting to sputter a bit, because the fathers of analytic philosophy, namely Quine, Carnap, and so on, were then starting to move and questioning their own discipline. Logical positivism more or less fell apart, particularly with Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein. So now there is this thing, analytic philosophy, that is out there, but if they had moved away from Platonism, then they were moving away from philosophy. So then what was it going to be? You know, do we call this philosophy, and are we engaged in philosophical pursuits, or something else? You know. So
Right.
Rorty was also in the center of this. Now, Rorty jumped away from analytic philosophy into pragmatism because he thought that pragmatism was the saving grace here. And then very much influenced by Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, he puts those hyphens amongst one another. Also, this was the time when continental philosophy was starting to gain more of a foothold in another camp over here in the North American academic realm.
Okay.
So you have analytic philosophy on the one side, and then you have the continental philosophers on the other. This is all the way back in the early to mid 70s.
Okay.
So, and I think that is good for the introduction.
Okay.
Oh, wait, one other thing. Sorry, not quite yet. Let's skip around a bit. All right. So here's another passage. Rorty says, the pragmatist agrees that if one wants to preserve the notion of correspondence with reality, then a physicalistic theory of reference is necessary. But he sees no point in preserving that notion. The pragmatist has no notion of truth which would enable him to make sense of the claim that if we achieved everything we ever hoped to achieve by making assertions, we might still be making false assertions, failing to correspond to something. And then later on, he says, on James's view, William James, true resembles good or rational in being a normative notion, a compliment paid to sentences that seem to be paying their way and that fit in with other sentences which are doing so. To think that truth, capital T, is out there is, on their view, on all fours with the Platonic view that the good is out there. Indeed, this is one of the highest forms in the Platonic corpus, is the good.
For sure.
To think that we are irrationalist, insofar as it does not gratify our souls to know that though we perish, truth is so, is like thinking that we are irrationalist just insofar as it does not gratify our moral sense to think that the moral law shines resplendent over the noumenal world, regardless of the vicissitudes of spatio-temporal lives. For the pragmatist, the notion of truth as something objective is just a confusion between, one, most of the world it is as it is whenever we think about it, that is, our beliefs have very limited causal efficacy, and two, there is something out there in addition to the world called the truth about the world, what James sarcastically called this tertium quid, intermediate between the facts per se, on the one hand, and all knowledge of them, actual or potential, on the other. The pragmatist wholeheartedly asserts to one, not as an article of metaphysical faith, but simply as a belief that we never had any reason to doubt. It cannot make sense of 2. When the realist tries to explain 2 with 3, the truth about the world consists in a relation of correspondence between certain sentences, many of which no doubt have yet to be formulated, and the world itself. The pragmatist can only fall back on saying, once again, that many centuries of attempts to explain what correspondence is have failed, especially when it comes to explaining how the final vocabulary of future physics will somehow be nature's own, the one which, at long last, lets us formulate sentences which knock onto nature's own way of thinking of herself. Okay, so in other words, the problems here are that to talk about the correspondence theory is, if we're talking about the world as a collection of physical objects, then the physicalist theory of reference is you have physical marks that refer to physical objects. That's
Right.
what language is.
Right.
Okay. Sounds and physical marks on paper that refer to physical things. Okay. That would be probably the most plausible way to come up with a correspondence theory of truth. Yet that falls short. And really at the root of what the problem is nobody seems to be able to clearly define what correspondence is.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, like correspond to what exactly? Like, I think we were talking about this in the previous episode. Like, if you say the word apple corresponds to this apple there, it
Right.
could be called something else in a different language, but like linguistically speaking, like you were talking about, we decided to attach this word to apples, and then there also could be, I mean, I don't know, there could be some really different type of apples that look very dissimilar to each other also.
Sure. You also speak figuratively, such as, she's the apple of my eye.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Exactly.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then not to mention about fictional discourse, which coincidentally there is an essay in this collection here about fictional discourse, but we're not going to cover that this time.
Oh, yeah. I think I might have read that before when we were going over those with Hayden Bruce for his podcast.
Yeah. So then Rorty continues, he says, for these reasons, the pragmatist does not think that, whatever else philosophy of language may do, it is going to come up with a definition of true, which gets beyond James. He happily grants that it can do a lot of other things. Okay. And then, let's see. Okay, so then the next page, Rorty says, he, the pragmatist, does not think of himself as any kind of a metaphysician because he does not understand the notion of there being blank out there, except in the literal sense of out there, in which it means at a position in space. He does not find it helpful to explicate the Platonist conviction about the good or the numbers by saying that the Platonist believes that there is truth or falsity about blank, regardless of the state of our knowledge or the availability of procedures for inquiry. The is in this sentence seems to him just as obscure as the is in truth is so. Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's
So,
just an assertion, really.
right. It's just an assertion. Okay. So then, let's see. I think we can skip the rest of this and we will leave the introduction behind. Now let's go ahead to the first essay, The World Well Lost. In the book, this is on page 3. So Rorty begins, in the first paragraph he says, since Kant, we find it almost impossible not to think of the mind as divided into active and passive faculties, the former using concepts to interpret what the world imposes on the latter. We also find it difficult not to distinguish between those concepts which the mind could hardly get along without, and those which it can which it can take or leave alone. And we think of truths about the former concepts as necessary in the most proper and paradigmatic sense of the term. But as soon as we have this picture of the mind in focus, it occurs to us, as it did to Hegel, that those all-important a priori concepts, those which might determine what our experience of our morals will be, might have been different.
Yep.
Okay. So going to the next page, Rorty continues, the possibility of different conceptual schemes highlights the fact that a Kantian unsynthesized intuition, now remember that an intuition is what appears in the mind of a sensation, the content more or less, can exert no influence on how it is to be synthesized, and concepts result from the synthesization, or at best can exert only an influence we shall have to describe in a way as relative to a chosen conceptual scheme as our description of everything else. Insofar as a Kantian intuition is effable, meaning that it can be spoken, it is just a perceptual judgment, and thus not merely intuitive. Insofar as it is ineffable, that is, what cannot be spoken about, it is incapable of having an explanatory function.
Right.
Okay? So he's talking about conceptual schemes here. And this came about from Kuhn, Feyerabend, Paul Feyerabend, and then Wilfrid Sellars. So then speaking of conceptual schemes, there is such a thing as a conceptual scheme that holds everything together. Okay? So if we're perceiving something, and he's using the Kantian language here, we perceive something that is the intuition, it then becomes synthesized in a concept, and then within the Kantian schema, there is a conceptual scheme at work here. Everything kind of fits into place here.
That sounds like the way that cognition actually works, based on the way that that Jonathan Haidt describes it.
Sure. So he's talking about conceptual schemes there.
Mm-hmm.
But if it is ineffable, we can't speak about these things. It doesn't have an explanatory function. So if you're talking about a conceptual scheme, I mean, this is what I'm reading in a Rorty here. If you're talking about a conceptual scheme that you really cannot justify, or has no grounds of justification, or you can't explain what the conceptual scheme is, then does it really have an explanatory function?
Not really.
Not really. But that doesn't mean we do not proceed with conceptual schemes. We do all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then Rorty continues, the notion of alternative conceptual frameworks thus contains the seeds of doubt about the root notion of conceptual framework, and so of its own destruction. For once the faculty of receptivity, and more generally the notion of neural material, becomes dubious, doubt spreads easily to the notion of conceptual thought as shaping, and thus to the notion of the world spirit moving from one set of a priori concepts to the next. That's a hat tip to Hegel.
How so?
The world spirit.
Oh, okay.
The absolute.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So then it continues. The philosophical notion of meaning, against which Quine is protesting, as he says, the latest version of the idea, a philosophical tradition, one of whose incarnations with Kantian notion of concept. The notion of a choice among meaning postulates is the latest version of the notion of a choice among alternative conceptual schemes. So Quine talked about meaning postulates. What do we take as the root of a meaning? But this is just talking about conceptual schemes again, alternative conceptual schemes. Okay.
Right.
So then Rorty continues, I have been arguing that without the notions of the given and of the a priori, there can be no notion of the constitution of experience. Okay, so in other words, the given, which Sellars talked about the myth of the given is what is already present to the senses, such as a world, sensations, objects, all of these things. And then the a priori, which is prior to experience, that shapes the experience. Without talking about a given and without talking about the a priori, you can't talk about constitution of experience because you've already kicked away two of the pillars of that explanatory scheme.
Right.
Okay. Thus, there can be no notion of alternative experiences or alternative worlds to be constituted by the adoption of new a priori concepts. Okay. So if you get rid of the constitution of experience, you get rid of the notion of conceptual schemes, you can't talk about alternative experiences if you see things in another way.
Unless those a priori assumptions are wrong.
and you have to assert what the given is.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So then going to the next page, Rorty continues. There is, I think, no briefer way to decide on the soundness of this a priori argument against the possibility of alternative conceptual frameworks than to run over such possible stories. But this inconclusiveness is a feature this argument has in common with all interesting verificationalist, anti-skeptical arguments. It confirms to the following pattern. 1. The skeptic suggests that our own beliefs about, for example, other minds, tables and chairs, or how to translate French, have viable alternatives which unfortunately can never be known to hold, but which justify the suspension of judgment. 2. The anti-skeptic replies that the very meaning of the terms used shows that the alternatives suggested are not merely dubious, but in principle unverifiable, and thus not reasonable alternatives at all. 3. The skeptic rejoins that verificationalism confuses the essential order with the known order, and that it may well be that some alternative is true, even though we shall never know that it is. 4. The anti-skeptic replies that the matter is not worth debating until the skeptic spells out the suggested alternative in full detail, and insinuates that this cannot be done. 5. The controversy degenerates into a dispute about assuming the burden of proof, with the skeptic claiming that it is not up to him to build up a coherent story around his suggested alternative, but rather up to the anti-skeptic to show a priori that this cannot be done. In the case at hand, the skeptic is the fan of alternative conceptual frameworks, practicing his skepticism on a global scale by insinuating that our entire belief structure might dissolve, leaving not a rack behind, to be replaced by a complete but utterly dissimilar alternative. The Davidsonian anti-skeptic is in the position of asking how one could come to call any pattern of behavior evidence for such an alternative. The skeptic replies that perhaps we could never come to do so, but this merely shows how complete our egocentric predicament is. And so it goes.
So could you clarify what verificationists are again?
Sure. So that comes from logical positivism, which is making a claim about something. How does one verify it?
Okay.
Okay. How one is able to verify it comes up with a conceptual framework. The verification argument with the logical positivists, this is what mainly caused it to fall apart, because they say that unless it can be verified, the statement, and they were referring specifically to metaphysical claims, which you cannot verify one way or the other by empiricism. How do you verify the verification?
Right. And
Right.
that can be an endless regression.
It could. Now you could say that it's a priori, but what's the undergirding of the a priori? See? And so this is, again, what Rorty is getting into here, is that you say that something is a priori, a conceptual framework, a meaning postulate, what Quine had attacked. But what is the justification or the verification for that?
Right.
Hard to say, if you can even say it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So then continuing. Right. So then towards the end of the essay, Rorty says, now to put my cards on the table, I think that the realistic true believer's notion of the world is an obsession rather than an intuition. I also think that Dewey was right in thinking that the only intuition we have of the world as determining truth is just the intuition that we must make our new beliefs conform to a vast body of platitudes, unquestioned perceptual reports, and the like. So I am happy to interpret the upshot of the Davidson-Stroud argument in a Deweyan way. Stroud refers to Barry Stroud, who is a very well-known skeptic. But I have no arguments against the true believer's description of our so-called, quote, intuitions. All that can be done with the claim that only the world determines truth is to point out that the equivocation in the realist's own use of world, in the sense in which the world is just whatever the vast majority of our beliefs not currently in question are currently thought about, there is, of course, no argument.
Right.
So in one sense of world, the sense in which, except for a few fringe cases like gods, neutrinos, and natural rights, we now know perfectly well what the world is like and could not possibly be wrong about it. There is no argument about the point that it is the world that determines truth. All that determination comes to is that our belief that snow is white is true because snow is white, that our beliefs about the stars are true because of the way the stars are laid out, and so on.
Those just sound like a priori truths that can't necessarily be justified too.
Well, that's also a deflationist approach to truth, which
Yeah.
is snow is white if and only if snow is white.
Yeah.
The statement snow is white is true only if snow is white.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then it continues. He says the notion of the world is used in a phrase like different conceptual schemes carve up the world differently. Must be the notion of something completely unspecified and unspecifiable. The thing in itself, in fact. As soon as we start thinking of the world as atoms in the void, or sense data and awareness of them, or stimuli of a certain sort brought to bear upon organs of a certain sort, we have changed the name of the game. For we are now well within some particular theory about how the world is. But for purposes of developing a controversial and non-trivial doctrine of truth as correspondence, only an utterly vague characterization in some such terms as cause of the impacts upon our receptivity and goal of our faculty of spontaneity will do. Truth, in the sense of truth taken apart from any theory, and world taken as what determines such truth, are notions that were, like the terms subject and object given in consciousness, made for each other. Neither can survive apart from the other. To sum at this point, I want to claim that the world is either the purely vacuous notion of the inevitable cause of sense and goal of intellect, or else a name for the objects that inquiry at the moment is leaving alone. Those planks in the boat which are at the moment not being moved about. It seems to me that epistemology since Kant has shuttled back and forth between these two meanings of the term world, just as moral philosophy since Plato has shuttled back and forth between the good as a name for an ineffable touchstone of inquiry, which might lead to the rejection of all our present moral views, and as a name for the ideally coherent synthesis of as many of those views as possible. This equivocation seems to be essential to the position of those philosophers who see realism, or the correspondence theory of truth, as controversial or exciting theses.
Right.
Okay, so let's go back to the first sentence. I want to claim that the world is either the purely vacuous notion of the ineffable cause of sense and goal of intellect, or else a name for the objects that inquiry at the moment is leaving alone. Okay, so to speak about the world is just out there, but out there is a problematic phrase too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, out where? Where is it? Can I
Where
see
is
it?
it? A point in space, yes,
Yeah.
but where is space? Is space part of the world? Is time part of the world?
Yeah.
Yes.
Does space and time actually exist?
Yes. Are they both part of the world?
Yeah.
Okay. And that closes the essay.
Okay.
Okay. So the upshot of the essay is talking about the world, that notion, correspondence theory, a correspondence theory of truth. All these are problematic concepts, notions, in describing it.
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions so far?
No, I think that one's pretty clear.
Okay. So in these essays and in Philosophy of the Mirror of Nature, we're starting to see the implications of pragmatism. So Rorty is calling himself a pragmatist because he is consciously moving away from analytic philosophy, which, as a descendant of logical positivism, was really trying to ape the natural sciences and describing, as precisely as it could, about the world, describing the world, corresponding the sentences that correspond to the world, descriptions, verificationism, and so on. So he's moving away from that and deploying pragmatism as a way to talk about such things without falling into the trap of essentializing and reifying and adopting a realist approach, but you're not you assert that such things exist, or like he says about the world, it's what is, quote, out there that we're currently leaving alone. We move through the world, but we're not questioning the world all the time.
Yeah.
Okay.
We don't need to arrive at absolute truth.
No, we don't need to even worry ourselves about defining what truth is before we even talk about truth.
Right.
All right.
Is that different then from William James's theory of truth? Because it kind of sounds like it is, but I'm not sure. What would you say?
I think it's similar, because remember, James was the first. Well, okay, let me back up a minute. Peirce had talked about truth too, as truth is, what the community of inquirers is after. But remember, Peirce was a scientist,
right?
So his conception of truth is different from what James had talked about. James is a little bit more of it's a wider scope, because we talk about truth all the time. Oh yeah, that's true. What you say is true. What this guy says is true. What I read in this book is true, type of thing.
Yeah.
But what is it that we mean by true? It's almost like an intuition to say, yeah, it's true. Who could say that it's not true? I mean, I guess one person could say it's true, and then you get into an argument about who's right. But saying such things are true, we're not even thinking about a theory of truth.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So
it's just a useful word, basically.
It's a useful word. And that's part of what pragmatism is. Exactly. Is it useful? To say something that is true, it is a property of a sentence, the way Rorty defines it. Property of a sentence and leading to its usefulness.
Right.
Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and skip to the next essay I wanted to cover. This is chapter 3, Overcoming the Tradition, Heidegger and Dewey. Okay, I'm going to skip around a bit for this one. Page 37 in the book. Rorty begins in the first paragraph. He says, philosophers who envy scientists think that philosophy should deal only with problems formulated in neutral terms, terms satisfactory to all those who argue for competing solutions. Without common problems and without argument, it would seem, we have no professional discipline, nor even a method for disciplining our own thoughts. Without discipline, we presumably have mysticism, or poetry, or inspiration. At any rate, something which permits an escape from our intellectual responsibilities. Heidegger is frequently criticized for having avoided these responsibilities. His defenders reply that what he has avoided is not the responsibility of the thinker, but simply the tradition of metaphysics or ontology. Next page. Heidegger thinks that these various distinctions, which is thinking versus emotion, thought with a capital T, are themselves products of metaphysical system building. Okay? Since all the usual divisions between disciplines and all the usual ways of dividing man's life into stages or modes are the products of the various writers who constitute the tradition of Western ontology, that's a Heidegger term, we can hardly use these divisions to place the work of a man whose aim is to overcome that tradition. But one may still feel exasperated. There ought, one feels, to be some standard by which to judge Heidegger, some competitor running the same race. Tediously enough, however, Heidegger suggests that our sense of exasperation is just one more product of the notion that philosophy is supposed to be a competition between arguments, a notion which we get from Plato and whose consequences, 2,000 years later, were positivism and nihilism. To free ourselves from the notion that there ought to be competition here would be to free ourselves from what he calls, quote, the technical interpretation of thought. That is referring to techne.
Okay.
Which is a process of reflection in service to doing and making, and the root of the term technology.
Oh, okay. That makes
Okay.
sense.
Yes. All right, so then Rorty continues. One may feel tempted at this point to decide that Heidegger is not really a philosopher at all. This too would be foolish. Heidegger brilliantly carries to extremes a tactic used by every original philosopher. Heidegger is not the first to have invented a vocabulary whose purpose is to dissolve the problems considered by his predecessors, rather than to propose new solutions to them. Consider Hobbes and Locke on the problems of the scholastics, and Carnap and Ayer on, quote, pseudo-problems. He is not the first to have said that the whole mode of argument used in philosophy up until his day was misguided. Consider Descartes on method, and Hegel on the need for dialectical thinking. His seemingly arrogant claim that the tradition has exhausted its potentialities simply carries to its limit the sort of impatience sometimes manifested by quite mild-mannered philosophers in such remarks as, quote, all the arguments for and against utilitarianism were canvassed well before 1900, or, quote, all the worry about the external world is a result of confusing having a sensation with observing an object. In urging new vocabularies for the statement of philosophical issues, or new paradigms of argumentation, a philosopher cannot appeal to antecedent criteria of judgment, but he may have spectacular access. The scholastic's vocabulary never recovered from the sarcasm of the 17th century. Half the philosophy written since Hegel attempted the sort of triumphant dialectical synthesis offered in the Phenomenology. Descartes and Hegel may have seemed not real philosophers to many of their contemporaries, but they created new problems in place of the old, kept philosophy going by the sheer brilliance of their example, and appear retrospectively as stages in a progressive development. Okay, so the upshot is, to call again, this is in the 70s, to call Heidegger not a real philosopher is kind of to miss the point, because Heidegger is a product of the history of philosophy, while at the same time using the language of his predecessors to deconstruct it.
Right.
Okay. For example, he mentions Descartes. Descartes was attempting to move beyond by using the same language of the scholastics, the medieval philosophers.
Right.
Okay. Same thing with Hobbes and Locke, moving away from that. Now, also reading this, I can't help but notice that there is some shades of Deleuze here. What is philosophy with Guattari? Creation of concepts?
Yeah.
Type of thing?
Yeah.
Okay, so then Rorty continues, if it seems difficult to think of Heidegger coming to occupy the same position, it is because he does not, like Descartes and Hegel and Husserl and Carnap say, this is how philosophy has been. Let philosophy henceforth be like this. Rather, like Nietzsche and Wittgenstein and Dewey, he asks, given that this is how philosophy has been, what, if anything, can philosophy now be? Suggesting as they did that philosophy may have exhausted its potentialities, he asks whether the motives which led to philosophy's existence still exist and whether they should. Now, also a point about Heidegger is that he was also moving away from philosophy. Rather, he talked more about thinking about being in particular.
Yeah.
Later on in his career, after the Kehra, the turn, he is focusing more on the poets than he is about the philosophers.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's thinking rather than philosophy, but still using, particularly earlier with being in time, very much influenced by phenomenology and ontology up to that point. But he is still trying to move away from that.
Yeah.
Okay, so then Rorty continues. Dewey and Heidegger know exactly what their predecessors were worried about, and they each offer us an account of the dialectical course of the tradition. The self-image of a philosopher, his identification of himself as such, rather than as perhaps an historian or a mathematician or a poet, depends almost entirely upon how he sees the history of philosophy. It depends upon which figures he imitates and which episodes and movements he disregards. So a new account of the history of philosophy is a challenge which cannot be ignored. This suggests that insofar as there any sensible question of the form, who is right, Heidegger or the others, it is going to be a question about historiography. It is not as if historiography were less controversial than, say, epistemology or philosophy of language. It is rather that the adoption of a vocabulary, one's semi-conscious decision about which questions one is content to dissolve or ignore, and which one must set oneself to answer, is motivated almost entirely by a perception of one's relation to the history of philosophy.
Right. Yeah, that term historiography is important too. And
Yeah.
like it's been used by other post-structuralist philosophers like Foucault as well, of course.
Yes, historiography.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's see. Mm-hmm. Okay, so going on page 43, Rorty continues. Dewey begins a discussion of the distinction between theory and practice, with a distinction between the holy and the lucky. He thinks of religion and its heir philosophy as attending to the former. Workmanship and its heir technology look to the latter. So religion looks to the holy, workmanship looks to the lucky. Because philosophy inherited the realm with which religion had been concerned, it naturally adopted the notion, which has ruled philosophy ever since the time of the Greeks, that the office of knowledge is to uncover the antecedently real. Given the further inheritance from religion of the premise that only the completely fixed and unchanging can be real, it is natural that the quest for certitude has determined our basic metaphysics. Metaphysics is a substitute for custom as the source and guarantor of higher moral and social values, and will remain so until we recognize that the distinctive office, problems, and subject matter of philosophy grow out of stresses and strains in the community life in which a given form of philosophy arises, and until philosophy as criticism of morals and intuitions takes the place of the whole brood and nest of dualisms which have formed the problems of philosophy, termed modern. The little dualisms of subject-object, mind-matter, experience-nature are seen by Dewey as dialectical diminutions of the great dualism between the holy and the lucky, the enduring and the day-to-day. Should we overcome all these dualisms, then philosophy might be, instead of impossible attempts to transcend experience, the significant record of the efforts of men to formulate the things of experience to which they are most deeply and passionately attached.
Yeah, I like that, trying to break down these dualistic concepts.
Oh, yes, for sure. Derrida will take this up again, too.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, but notice the language that Dewey uses here. Metaphysics is a substitute for custom as the source and guarantor of higher moral and social values.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Dewey was sort of an anti-metaphysician, or he was more naturalistic. What is it? Yeah, Dewey's naturalistic metaphysics. You know, taking it out of the transcendent realm and putting it more into the immanent realm.
Right.
Okay. So the notion which has ruled philosophy ever since the time of the Greeks, that the office of knowledge is to uncover the antecedently real, prior to experience. And then the quest for certitude, the inheritance from religion of the premise that only the completely fixed and unchanging can be real. So that is a testament to how early Christianity, particularly in the West, took Greek metaphysics as a pillar on which it built. Now, Shane might say something to the contrary about this, is that Orthodox Christianity never really took to Greek philosophy in the same way.
Yeah.
But we're talking about the West here. Okay, Dewey is a product of the West. And then the quest for certitude has determined our basic metaphysics. As a matter of fact, one of Dewey's books is called The Quest for Certainty, a criticism of it.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. So continuing, Rorty says, Dewey and Heidegger agree that this initial adoption of a spectatorial notion of knowledge and its object has determined the subsequent history of philosophy. So there is a spectator observing the world and observing knowledge and taking knowledge in passively. Heidegger's claim in Being and Time that the neglect of Zuhandensein, which is a German term for the being of being at hand, present, lies behind the Cartesian problem of the existence of the external world, parallels Dewey's reiterated claim that the, quote, brood and nest of dualisms, which appeared in the 17th century, was due to the initial split between the enduring subject of contemplation and the malleable objects of the artisan. For both Dewey and Heidegger, the notion of the object as something to be viewed and represented led to subjectivism. Okay, so the enduring object of contemplation and the malleable objects of the artisan.
Right.
Okay, the initial split there.
Okay.
All right, so then continuing. Both men say that things which reduce to despair the eager and sincere epistemologist, anxious to classify them as idealists or realists or objectivists. Then continuing, when they discuss the relation between philosophy and science, this is Heidegger and Dewey, both men see Cartesian, Husserlian, and positivistic attempts to, quote, make philosophy scientific as a disastrous abandonment of philosophy's proper function.
For sure.
For sure. Okay. All right. And then a couple more quotes here. Didn't want to get too deep into this essay. All right. So then Rorty continues. He says, Dewey wants the tradition overcome by blurring all the distinctions it has drawn, whereas Heidegger hopes being, capital B, will overcome it for us by granting us a sense of the ontological difference. In particular, Dewey wants the distinctions between art, science, and philosophy to be rubbed out and replaced with the vague and uncontroversial notion of intelligence, trying to solve problems and provide meaning. Heidegger is equally contemptuous of the traditional distinctions, save one. He does not want philosophy to be lost in this shuffle, and would view Dewey's attempt to mislay it as resulting from the assumption that thought, capital T, is coextensive with an ontology.
I remember us going over Heidegger's perspective in terms of philosophy, in that when we went over his essay on Nietzsche's famous God is dead phrase with Shane as well.
Yes. Okay. One way of bringing the difference to a point is to say that Dewey thinks of philosophy as a discipline or even as a distinct human activity as obsolete. Heidegger, on the other hand, thinks of philosophy, of thought as opposed to ontology, as something which might be recaptured, even though the form it might take is, in our darkened world, still invisible.
Right.
Okay. So Dewey, let's do away with philosophy. Heidegger, on the other hand, changing philosophy to thought, philosophy to thinking, and then thinking as opposed to ontology. It could be recaptured, but
right.
in a slightly different way.
Right.
And then ending, Rorty says to conclude, what Dewey and Heidegger both wanted was a way of seeing things which would take us far beyond the world of historicist philosophizing, which succeeded Hegel, as Hegel had taken us beyond the epistemologically oriented philosophy of the 18th century. Dewey found what he wanted in turning away from philosophy as a distinctive activity altogether, and towards the ordinary world, the problems of men, firstly seen by discarding the distinctions which the philosophical tradition had developed. Heidegger hoped that a new path would open, but he thought we shall only see it open if we detach ourselves from the problem of men and are still. In that silence, we may perhaps hear the word of being. Which of these attitudes one adopts depends on how devoted one is to the notion of philosophy. Heidegger's weakness was that he could not escape the notion that philosophers' difficulties are more than just philosophers' difficulties. The notion that if philosophy goes down, so will the West.
Okay. That's
All right.
interesting.
Yes. So Dewey is all the more important to Rorty because Dewey was moving away from metaphysics, moving away from philosophy, and focusing more on kind of the here and now and the quote problems of men.
Right.
So philosophy was important at one time, but now it's not so important.
Yeah.
Because we have bigger fish to fry.
Okay.
Whereas Heidegger still wants to retain that philosophy is very important because the West will collapse if we don't keep philosophy.
That's a little dramatic.
It is a little dramatic, yes. I agree. All right. Question so far?
No, I think that's interesting, contrasting those two views between Dewey and Heidegger. It kind of brings me back to what we were talking about earlier. I mean, it depends on what you're using philosophy for. Like, are you just investigating it for a fun intellectual exercise, or to sharpen your critical thinking skills, or do you think that it should be used for focusing on real life problems?
Yes. And so the real life problems are what the pragmatists were trying to do.
Yeah.
Now, one could say that since that time, there hasn't been an equal stress that traditional analytic or continental hasn't done.
Yeah.
What is continental mostly? Focuses a little bit more on things like politics and ethics and art, stuff like that. It is not as arid. I mean, this was one thing that I noticed about analytic philosophy, is that to a certain extent, it's interesting, but it's kind of arid.
Yeah, it is.
Yes, where you're only focusing on problems of science or paradoxes, logical paradoxes, transcendental arguments, grounding truth, and things like that, but it doesn't have a whole lot of application to the day-to-day.
Right.
Okay. All right. If no other questions, let's go ahead and press on. Let's go to chapter 6, Philosophy as a Kind of Writing, an essay on Derrida. So this is page 90 in the book. Let's see. All right. So I want to reiterate an earlier point. In the 1970s, Derrida was starting to come under the scene. He was around for a few years before. I think he started really writing in the late 60s when he was still in France. But then his work starts to be translated into English, and then they made their way over into the Anglo-American sphere. Okay. For all of his life, when Derrida came over here to the States as a visiting professor, he never ended up in a philosophy department. It was always a literature or comparative literature department.
Oh, okay.
Also, he never really ended up in the elite institutions. He was a visiting professor for many years at, of all places, the University of California at Irvine.
Okay.
Same thing for Lyotard. You know, they didn't make the circuit at Harvard and Yale all that often, or Princeton, or
Right.
Stanford, or places like that.
Right.
And then coincidentally, Rorty, too, throughout his academic career, he started off in philosophy when he was at Princeton. But then when he moved to the University of Virginia, which is not too far away here from DC, he was in a comparative literature department, or it was something along those lines, like humanity. I think he was a professor of humanities at the University of Virginia.
Okay.
Then in the very late part of his career, he took up a position at Stanford in comparative literature. So he was only part of a philosophy department at one point in his life.
Okay.
Derrida never was part of a philosophy department.
Okay.
Okay.
Is that similar to Foucault? Like, what was the status about Foucault in terms of that?
I don't remember. Foucault, was he a philosophy department? He might have been. I don't remember.
Because I mean, like a lot of his writing, it's like I guess a lot of it is historiography, and similar to Dewey, it doesn't seem as much like what what many people would define as philosophy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for much of his academic career, he wasn't a professor. He might have been a visiting professor here and there. In fact, I think he was a visiting professor here in the States for a time towards the end of his life. But you know, he was a cultural attaché in some of the embassies. You know, this is all part of his life, and definitely in France, he was a member of the Collège de France, which is an academic institution that is a research institution. It's not teaching. The professors that are there are obligated to give a series of lectures throughout the year, free of charge, to students and the lay public.
Oh, okay.
But it's a research institution primarily. They don't have students.
That sounds like a much more fun way to use your degree than for teaching.
I think so.
For me, anyway.
Yeah, but those are hard positions to get.
Yeah.
You have to be a well-established academic. I mean, the Collège de France isn't just for humanities. There are also mathematicians and scientists that are on the faculty.
Okay.
Okay. Just look at the current roster. All right. So, where to begin here? Okay. So let's go to page 93. Rorty begins. He says, to understand Derrida, one must see his work as the latest development in this non-Kantian dialectical tradition, the latest attempt of the dialecticians to shatter the Kantians' ingenious image of themselves as accurately representing how things really are. Derrida talks a lot about language, and it is tempting to view him as a, quote, philosopher of language, whose work might one usefully compare with other inquiries concerning the relations between words and the world. But it would be less misleading to say that his writing about language is an attempt to show why there should be no philosophy of language. On his view, language is the last refuge of the Kantian tradition, of the notion that there is something eternally present to man's gaze, the structure of the universe, the moral law, the nature of language, which philosophy can let us see more clearly. The reason why the notion of philosophy of language is an illusion is the same reason why philosophy, Kantian philosophy, philosophy is more than a kind of writing, is an illusion.
Interesting.
Okay. He continues. Derrida has little to tell us about language, but a great deal to tell us about philosophy. To get a handle on his work, one might take him as answering the question, given that philosophy is a kind of writing, why does this suggestion meet with such resistance? This becomes in his work the slightly more particular question, what must philosophers who object to this characterization think writing is, that they should find the notion that this is what they are doing so offensive? Whereas Heidegger, Derrida's great father figure, was the first to place, or if you prefer, transcend or castrate, Hegel by giving a historical characterization of Hegel's historicism. Derrida wishes to place, or whatever, Heidegger by explaining Heidegger's distrust of writing. Heidegger, it is true, wrote a lot, but always, after the turn, in the interests of urging us to be still and listen to the single line of verse, the individual Greek word. Derrida is suspicious of Heidegger's preference for the simplicity and splendor of the word spoken on the hill, and also of his contempt for the footnote scribbled in the ergastulum down in the valley. The preference, he thinks, betrays a fatal taint of Kantianism, of the Platonic metaphysics of presence, key term. For it is characteristic of the Kantian tradition that no matter how much writing it does not think that philosophy should be written, any more than science should be. Writing is an unfortunate necessity. What is really wanted is to show, to demonstrate, to point out, to exhibit, to make one's interlocutor stand at gaze before the world. Okay? So, particularly with Of Grammatology, Derrida is criticizing what he calls the metaphysics of presence, which is, there seems to be this thread in the history of Western philosophy that philosophers treated writing as a necessary evil, but it was deficient compared to speech.
Right.
Okay. So, kind of stands to reason. You and I are speaking in real time. This will have more an effect on both of us and anybody that's listening to this than it would if we were to write a dialogue down.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there is some benefits to writing a dialogue down because you can more clearly state your argument, and then you can respond to arguments more clearly too.
It would have
Instead of
been cool if, like, if philosophers going back to Plato and Socrates could have done podcasts.
For sure. Now, there is some merit in engaging in a dialogue and having things spoken, but why would one necessarily prioritize that versus writing? I mean, there is a lot of writing, and in fact, as you said, if Plato and Aristotle had did their own podcasts, think of what that would have looked like.
Yeah.
But they didn't exist back then.
Yeah.
And we didn't exist back in their day where we could have heard them speak.
That would have been pretty cool too.
It would have been pretty cool. So
Yeah.
what are we left with? We're left with their writings.
Right.
And
nothing wrong with writing. I love writing.
Well, yeah, there's nothing wrong with writing. However, writing doesn't necessarily capture what's in speech either, or what's in real time, what's going on in your head. So the whole thing about the metaphysics of presence is that, yeah, the philosophers, they denigrate writing. They treat it as a necessary evil, where what Derrida is trying to get away from is prioritizing speech as presence. And instead, writing is as important, maybe not more important, but certainly is important in looking at philosophy. And then, as the title of the essay is, what Rorty come up with is philosophy is a kind of writing. Remember that I pointed out in the introduction Rorty's use of the term genre.
Right.
Philosophy is a literary genre itself. Stands to reason, because if you've read enough of philosophy over the years, you find that there are many different ways to write philosophy. Could be in poetry, could be in dialogue form, could be in argumentation, very clear and rigorous argumentation. Definitely a lot of prose, or it could be in novel form. I remember the one novel, Sophie's Choice. Was it Sophie's Choice? Sophie's World. They came out in the mid-90s, Justine Gardner. Okay, that was a novel about the history of philosophy in novel form.
Yeah. Like, I can't think of that many philosophers who wrote fiction, but Sartre is an example, of course. And I think the only, I think the only fiction by a philosopher that I've read is Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Right. So those are two examples of philosophers that certainly would have said that their style of writing was, in Sartre's case, he certainly would have said that his novels explained his philosophy much better than his treatises did.
Oh, okay.
And Nietzsche took up the aphoristic approach.
Right.
Okay. And then, as you mentioned about Thus Spake Zarathustra, that was a fictional way of approaching philosophy.
Yeah.
Okay. So then Rorty continues, philosophical writing, for Heidegger as for the Kantians, is really aimed at putting an end to writing. For Derrida, writing always leads to more writing, and still more. Just as history does not lead to absolute knowledge, or the final struggle, but to more history and still more. Derrida wants to keep the horizontal character of Hegel's notion of philosophy without its teleology, its sense of direction, its seriousness. So, writing is not teleological. It is not working up to some end, some manifestation, some apotheosis somewhere. Rather, one writes, there is writing on that, there is more writing on that, there is more writing on that, there is more writing on that.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
All right. So then continuing. Consider Derrida as trying to create a new thing for writing to be about. Not the world, but texts. Books tell the truth about things. Texts comment on other texts. And we should stop trying to test text for accuracy of representation. Notice the difference here, books versus texts.
Does he mean like any nonfiction book as opposed to like an academic philosophy book?
Sure. The notion of the book is that it's something that's self-contained.
Okay.
Okay. So the Bible, for example, is a book.
Yeah.
It's self-contained. It has gone through many revisions over the centuries. It was compiled according to certain dictates from councils many centuries ago. If you want the essence of what the Christian faith is, you go to the Bible. There it is, self-contained.
Yeah.
Is the Bible a text? Yes. But is every text the Bible? No.
No.
And then what counts as a text? Now, this might be the subject for another podcast series too, about looking at what is a text.
Yeah.
A text is certainly writing on a page, whether it's handwritten or typed. But could one also say that an audiobook is a text, or a YouTube video is a text?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Depends on how you look at it.
Depends on how you look at it. Exactly. Okay, getting back to this. So Derrida, quote, reading cannot legitimately transgress the text towards something other than it, toward the referent, a reality that is metaphysical, historical, psychobiographical, etc., or toward a signifier outside the text whose content could have taken place outside of language, that is to say, in the sense that we give here to that word, outside of writing in general. There is nothing outside of the text. Aha, il n'y a pas de texte.
Yes.
But that's not a correct translation. There's nothing outside of the text.
Yeah, what's the correct one again?
The literal translation should be there is no outside text.
Okay.
Meaning no context. Nothing outside of a context.
That makes sense.
Okay. So then Rorty continues. Derrida regards the need to overcome the book. The notion of a piece of writing is aimed at an accurate treatment of a subject, conveying a message which, in more fortunate circumstances, might have been conveyed by ostensive or pointing definition or by injecting knowledge straight into the brain. As justifying.
Oh, sorry. I just was thinking as you were talking to just wanted to note about there's nothing outside of the text mistranslation. That's another popular straw man that people say about so-called postmodernists, that there's nothing outside the text.
Right.
As if to say that this is the only interpretation, and use that to say that they're being hypocritical when they're doing that, which is just based on a mistranslation, as you pointed out.
Yes. Bunch of dum-dums.
Yeah.
Or by injecting knowledge straight into the brain, as justifying his use of any text to interpret any other text.
Yeah.
The most shocking thing about his work, Derrida's work, even more shocking than, though not so funny as, his sexual interpretations of the history of philosophy, is his use of multilingual puns, joke etymologies, allusions from anywhere to anywhere, and phonic and typographical gimmicks. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then continuing. He, meaning Derrida, has no interest in bringing his philosophy into accord with common sense. He is not writing a philosophy. He is not giving an account of anything. He is not offering a comprehensive view of anything. He is not protesting against the errors of a philosophical school. He is, however, protesting against the notion that the philosophy of language, pursued, quote, realistically as the study of how language hooks onto the world, is something more than one more quaint little genre, that it is first philosophy. But the protest is not because he has a different candidate for the position of first philosophy. It is against the notion of first philosophy. He could, if he liked, say that he too can pass judgments within this genre, that he recognizes better and worse, quote, realistic philosophy of language, that he agrees with all up-to-date philosophers of language that Strawson and Searle were terribly wrong about the reference of proper names, and so on. But what he really wants to do is, what he really wants to do is to say, you used to think that all was terribly important to get meaning and reference, and all that, right? But it isn't. You only thought that because. He might be compared with the secularist who says not there is no God, but rather all this talk about our relation to God is getting in our way. James, when he said that the true is what is good in the way of belief, was simply trying to debunk epistemology. He was not offering a theory of truth. So Derrida, when he says il n'y a pas de haut texte, is not putting forward an ontological view. He is trying to debunk Kantian philosophy generally.
How is he debunking Kantian philosophy by doing that?
Well, Kantian referring here to something transcendental. And
okay.
As in the transcendental, the grounding of epistemology.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but note the prior part of this. It's not putting forward an ontological view, which is why it really bugged the shit out of me. Well, I shouldn't say it really bugs the shit out of me. That would have at one time. But now I just kind of roll my eyes when people are saying, well, how can you say nothing exists outside the text? I'm flying in an airplane, right? This rock falls on my head.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. It's not an ontological view.
Yeah. I mean, philosophers don't tend to be that dumb, I would say, to write something like that.
Right. Nor are they particularly subtle here in this respect.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So then Rorty continues. To this one can only reiterate that Derrida is in the same situation in regard to language that many of us secularists, Rorty with an atheist, by the way, are in regard to God. It isn't that we believe in God, or don't believe in God, or have suspended judgment about God, or consider that the God of theism is an inadequate symbol of our ultimate concern. It is just that we wish we didn't have to have a view about God. It isn't that we know that God is a cognitively meaningless expression, or that it has its role in a language game other than the fact stating, or whatever. We just regret the fact that the word is used so much. So it is for Derrida with the vocabulary of Kantian philosophy. His attitude towards centuries of worry about the relation between subject and object, representations and the real, is like the Enlightenment attitude towards centuries of worry about the relation between God and man, faith and reason. Indeed, for Derrida as for Heidegger, these worries are all the same worry. The worry that we may lose touch with certain exigencies, conformity with which is the whole duty of man. For Derrida as for Freud, these are all forms of the worry about what our fathers require of us. For Derrida as for Sartre, these are all forms of the attempt to know oneself by transforming oneself into a knowable object, a being in itself which obeys the laws of its kind.
Okay. Yeah, I like Richard Rorty's position on God. Like, who cares whether God exists or not?
Right. He just wished that we didn't have to talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I had said in the beginning is that part of the reason why I'm going through Rorty is leading up to what he had to say about religion in the later part of his career. And in the collection, which was also with Gianni Vattimo about weak thought, there is an essay in there titled Atheism and Anti-Clericalism.
Okay.
I'm not going to define what anti-clericalism is now. We'll save that for when we get to the essay. But I think that was a better restatement of what his position was. He did say that he was an atheist, but I think he was a sophisticated atheist. Certainly not of the Richard Dawkins ilk.
Right.
rather it's like, okay, does it really matter whether we believe in God or not? I really wish we didn't have to talk about it so much.
Yeah. And part of the reason, that's part of one of the differences between people like him and militant atheists like Richard Dawkins is that he doesn't have as much of a problem with religion as people like that do. Like, it's not a virus or a cancer.
Right. And if you're a sophisticated atheist, and Rorty is certainly not the only one that was like that, it's just like with religion. It's more or less a private affair.
Yeah.
If you believe in God, you believe in God. If I don't believe in God, I don't believe in God.
Yeah, I
That
think
doesn't mean we still
Hayden's
can't
kind
have
of
intelligent
attracted to
conversations about
that.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Hayden's kind of attracted to that notion about it. At least I've seen him tweet a few things, and he's asked me a few questions about that.
What? That religion is a private matter?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think he actually asked me a question about not religion in terms of that, but basically the same sort of thing in terms of politics the other day. And I was saying, I don't know, like, I don't see the problem with sharing your political or religious views in public. I mean, unless you want to like avoid a conflict, if you know that you're talking with a really opinionated person.
Right. Yeah, I don't. I mean, I think it depends on the person too.
Yeah,
I do not, for the life of me, understand a militant atheist. Really.
I do, because I used to be one.
Oh, sure. You of all people would know that.
Yeah.
But now that you have outgrown being a militant atheist, and after you've gone through enough philosophy with me, and now we're looking at Rorty, um, you still could be an atheist, or you could be an agnostic. A
Mhm.
practical atheist or pragmatic atheist is another term that's gone out there, where it is you're an atheist when it comes to the day to day. You may or may not believe in God, but you're not really really deploying in that well in your day to day life.
That sounds like a lot of religious people.
Yeah, I mean, lots of religious people are just nominal religious
Yeah.
people. They go to church, they go through the motions, they say the Nicene Creed, they put their $20 on the collection plate, and then they go about their business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm certainly way more like Rorty now, I would say. I mean, like, I do debate with my religious friends like Shane sometimes about the existence of God, but mostly just because it's a fun intellectual exercise.
Sure, but
Yeah.
I do have to respect, because Rorty, as far as I could tell, really didn't have much to say about orthodoxy. Lots of philosophers really didn't have much to say about orthodoxy.
Yeah. I guess like it kind of would make sense that Western philosophers in general would be more knowledgeable about Western versions of religion, since orthodoxy is more of like an Eastern version of it.
Right. Also, that philosophy and theology were very, very tightly wound together throughout the history of Western philosophy.
Right.
Because what I had mentioned before, this is well documented, is that early Christianity took on the trappings of Greek philosophy.
Yeah.
As God is the unchanging being, that comes from Greek philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Orthodoxy didn't go down that route.
Yeah. Yeah,
So, and
like
I confess my ignorance with orthodoxy. I'm not as acquainted of it as I probably should be. There's certainly some good resources out there. Jay Dyer happens to be one. Been listening to him religiously, pardon the pun, over the past month or so.
okay.
Binging through his podcasts. So you might want to
Yeah.
check him out.
Yeah, Shane obviously helps us learn more about it in our postmodern theology episodes, when we go through all of our different perspectives, and including his orthodox perspective.
Yes. So now, the next time we do postmodern theology, you could say, "Well, guys, I'm a Rortian. Why do we have to talk about God so much?"
Yeah.
Because it's fun. That's why.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Okay. So getting back to Rorty here, he says he, meaning Derrida, is suggesting how things might look if we did not have Kantian philosophy built into the fabric of our intellectual life, as his predecessors suggested how things might look if we did not have religion built into the fabric of our moral life. The secularists I speak of were continually assailed by the question, What argument do you have for not believing in God? Derrida is continually assailed by the question, what argument do you have for saying that we should not refer to the text as something which is not a text? Neither has any interesting arguments, because both are not working by the same rules as their opponents. They are trying to make up some new rules. Lack of seriousness, and the sense in which I just attributed it to Derrida, is simply the refusal to take the standard rules seriously, conjoined with a refusal to give a clear answer to the question, is it the old game played differently, or rather a new game?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good question.
So then he continues, there is another sense, however, in which Derrida is very serious indeed, as serious as the prophets of secularization. He is serious about the need to change ourselves, serious about what he calls deconstruction.
Ah.
Okay.
Deconstruction.
Yes. Thus he warns us against taking grammatology, a term that he coined, as the name of a new research program, as an attempt at doing something constructive and progressive. When he speaks of, quote, the systematic crossing out of the arche and the transformation of general semiology into a grammatology, the latter performing a critical work upon which everything within semiology, right down to its matrical concept of signs, that retains any metaphysical presuppositions incompatible with the theme of difference. Semiology.
Oh, sorry.
So semiology is semiotics.
Okay, that's what I was
Study of
going to ask.
science. Yeah.
Okay, and what's what was that word? The arche.
Arche. That's a Greek philosophical term. It refers to the starting point.
Okay.
Okay, one can easily conclude from such passages as this that Derrida conceives of his work as purely negative, deconstructing the metaphysics of presence in order to leave the text bare, unburdened by the need to represent. Such a view is also suggested by his excusing his high-handed treatment of Saussure in this way. I'm going to go ahead and skip that. Right. Okay. So the point there, the previous point, one can easily conclude from such passages as this that he is doing a purely negative work, deconstructing the metaphysics of presence in order to leave the text bare, unburdened by the need to represent. Now, some other theologians like John Caputo has taken Derrida as a model of negative theology, which is not unique to Derrida, that has existed from centuries before. The negative theology is talking about God or talking about the divine as what it is not, rather than what it is.
Right.
Okay. So
I think isn't there a chapter in the Cambridge Companion to Postmodernism about that, which we'll talk about at some point?
I think so.
Okay.
That might be the post-metaphysical essay.
Okay.
Related to that, yeah. But also in Orthodoxy, there's the via negativa, as it's called, the apophantic theology.
Right. I was trying to think of those terms that
Instead of cataphatic, yeah, cataphatic versus apophantic.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right. So Rorty continues. Derrida thinks that the proper moral to draw is that language is not a tool, but that in which we live and move. So to ask, how does language manage to do its job, betrays psychological nominalism. If all awareness is a linguistic affair, then we are never going to be aware of a word on the one hand, and a thing denuded of words on the other, and see that the first is adequate to the second. This is a criticism of correspondence and representation. But the very notions of sign and representation and language convey the notion that we can do something like that. The notion of philosophy of language as the successor subject to epistemology suggests that we have now found out how to study representation properly, and thus to do properly the job which Kant saw needed to be done. So you were asking the question about what does Kantianism mean? Here is shorthand for representation.
Okay.
In the mind.
Okay.
the epistemological project.
Okay.
Okay. Given this situation, Derrida looks about for a way to say something about language which will not convey the idea of sign or representation or supplement. His solution consists in such notions as trace, which have recently become something very much like a new subject matter for his followers. But in developing this alternative, Derrida comes perilously close to giving us a philosophy of language, and thereby perilously close to slipping back into what he and Heidegger call the tradition of ontotheology, which is taking being as the highest form.
Right.
Okay?
I remember. I think I actually watched a video about that last week.
Yes,
That's gonna take at least a few more times hearing about it to have that word solidified in my brain.
Right. Ontotheology. Ontotheology.
Yeah.
Say it to yourself as you're going to sleep.
Yeah.
Okay. So then Rorty continues on the next page. Writing is one of the representatives of the trace in general. It is not the trace itself. The trace itself does not exist. To exist is to be an entity, a being present, to on. Okay. So just one comment here about Derrida. This is the earlier part, is that he comes up with the notion of the trace. Okay, so what is a trace? A trace is something that is there or is kind of a representation of something that was there. There still is a sort of presence, but it is not fully present. Does that make sense?
Mm.
When you talk of the trace of fill in the blank, the trace of murder was in the air.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
Yeah, I think so.
that's what they mean by trace.
Okay.
Okay, so it is a way to it is a representation of something that was there but is not fully there.
Okay.
Okay, but it is also not representation. Writing is one of the representatives of the trace in general. So the thing about writing, and again, this is also the criticism about the metaphysics of presence, is that with any kind of a writing, okay, like tomorrow morning, you take out a blank sheet of paper and you write down your thoughts. All right. It happened, you put it on paper, and then maybe you put it away. So centuries from now, if somebody finds it in your desk drawer, they pull it out, they look at it, and they say, okay, Andrew Meitzer, these were his thoughts on the morning of, what is tomorrow?
17th.
17th of January, 2020. Okay, we have his thoughts that he was thinking right then that day.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not there, present. Your voice is not there, present. Nor your thoughts really there, present. But your writing is a trace of those.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So, the criticism here is that philosophers in general would have taken your voice, in real time to be the one true. And writing is just is a byproduct in one respect, or it's a supplement. That's another term that Derrida likes to use a lot in of grammatology, is the supplement. It's not
Okay.
fully there, but it is there in support of something else.
Okay.
But since we were not alive in Plato and Aristotle's time, and they're not with us, all we have to rely on is the writing. There is a trace of their thoughts there,
Right.
which is very much wrapped up with interpretation, for one thing, and the writing itself could take on a life of its own. What we read of Aristotle, this is the case when they talk about spurious documents. Okay, this is attributed to a particular philosopher, but we don't know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
We think that Aristotle, Plato, Locke, Descartes wrote this because it's kind of his style.
Yeah.
But we don't know for sure if it is or not. We just accept it as, okay, we accept it now maybe at some point in the future will be disproven. Some new evidence comes out where no, it is not theirs. Once was attributed to that person is no longer theirs.
Yeah. It's kind of like how I think I've heard some people say that there's speculation about whether Plato just invented the character of Socrates or not.
Right. Or, in a slightly more contemporary example, did Shakespeare write all of his plays?
Yeah, I've heard rumors about that
That's been a
too. Yeah.
long-standing controversy where other authors might have written the plays, or I think this is definitely the latest scholarship is what is it, the Oxford Shakespeare, which came out in the past few years, is that there are some plays where the scholars co-credit Shakespeare with somebody else. Shakespeare did not write
Oh,
the play himself. He wrote
oh,
it
wow.
with somebody else,
Okay.
where for a long time it was attributed to just Shakespeare.
Right. Oh,
And
okay.
then the long-standing thing about, well, did Francis Bacon write some of the plays? Did Christopher Marlowe write some of the plays? You know, I remember that all the way back from high school when I first started studying Shakespeare.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So continuing, Rorty says, Kantian philosophy on Derrida's view is a kind of writing, which would not like to be a kind of writing. It is a genre which would like to be a gesture, a clap of thunder, an epiphany. That is where God and man, thought and its object, words and the world meet. We want speechlessly to say, let no further words come between the happy pair. Kantian philosophers would like not to write, but just to show. They would like the words they use to be so simple as to be presuppositionless. Some of them like to think that physics, too, is not a kind of writing. So they cherish the thought that, at least in some countries, philosophy has no literary pretensions because it has attained the secure path of a science. Just as on the Kantian view of physics, physics has no need of a historical self-understanding to enable it to point straight to the heart of the matter. So on the Kantian view of philosophy, philosophers need not be concerned with their own Kantian motives in order to point straight to the heart of spirit, the relation of representation itself. Derrida's reply is that anybody can get along without literary pretensions, without writing, if he is content simply to demonstrate how something falls into place in a previously established context. Writing, as Derrida says in commenting on Rousseau, is to this kind of simple getting it right, as masturbation is to standard, solid, reassuring sex. Yes, he does. He does use those images in Grammatology. This is why writers are thought effete in comparison with scientists, the men of action of our later days. The important thing to notice is that the difference between the two forms of activity is not subject matter, not, for instance, a matter of the difference between the flinty particles of the hard sciences and the flexible behavior of the soft ones, but rather is determined by normality or abnormality. Normality in this sense is accepting without question the stage setting in the language which gives demonstration, scientific or ostensive, its legitimacy. Revolutionary scientists need to write, as normal scientists do not. Revolutionary politicians need to write, as parliamentary positions or politicians do not. Dialectical philosophers like Derrida need to write, as Kantian philosophers do not. Okay,
All right.
and then continuing, the non-Kantian knows that the edifice will itself one day be deconstructed, and the great deeds reinterpreted, and reinterpreted again and again. But of course, the non-Kantian is a parasite. Flowers could not sprout from the dialectical vine unless there were an edifice into whose chinks it could insert its tendrils.
I'm a parasite.
Yes, aren't we all? No constructors, no deconstructors. No norms, no perversions. Derrida, like Heidegger, would have no writing to do unless there were a metaphysics of presence to overcome. So he's criticizing Derrida here slightly. And then to refine, and then rounding out the essay. Derrida's point, I take it, is that that crosstalk is all we are going to get. and that no gimmick like the new science of grammatology is going to end or overcome it. Once one thinks of philosophy as a kind of writing, one should not be surprised at this result. For to think this is to stop trying to have a philosophy of language which is first philosophy, a view of all possible views, a bootstrap self-elevation to a point from which all past and future writing can be seen as contained within a permanent framework. Only one who had levitated to such a point would have the right to look down on writing, to view it as second best, like Plato, or as an abnormal activity to which sin has condemned him, like Rousseau, or as something which a discipline can dispense with on reaching the secure path of a science. Derrida's polemic against the notion that speech is prior to writing should be seen as a polemic against what Sartre calls bad faith, the attempt to divinize oneself by seeing in advance the terms in which all possible problems are to be set, and the criteria for their resolution. If the logocentric, Platonic notion of speech as prior to writing were right, there might be a last word. Derrida's point is that no one can make sense of the notion of a last commentary, a last discussion note, a good piece of writing which is more than the occasion for a better piece.
Oh yeah, I remember us talking about Rorty's thoughts on that too, in terms of like you can't find out any like final theory of language.
Right. Any final vocabulary.
Right. What could you remind me of what logocentric means again? I know it probably has to do with the logos.
It does. So in this respect, the logos is the word, but a capital word, and present word.
Okay.
Okay. It is not a written word.
Okay.
So logocentrism ties very much into the metaphysics of presence. That was the term that Derrida coined, logocentric.
Okay.
Prioritizing speech over writing.
Okay.
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 So the upshot of this here, as is the entire essay, is that Derrida was criticizing Kantian and Platonic presuppositions.
Right.
Okay. Plato, in the famous or infamous, depending on how you describe it, seventh letter, criticized writing, saying that it was deficient. Speech was the best.
Yeah, that's part of why Socrates allegedly never wrote anything down because he thought it was inferior to speech, right?
Using Socrates as a mouthpiece, yes.
Yeah.
Whether Socrates said that or not himself, I can't say because I haven't read that far in the literature. But
right.
Plato is certainly the prime example of prioritizing speech over writing.
Right.
Then with Kant, it is with the representationalism. Okay, that language accurately represents what is in the world. So what Derrida is doing here is through deconstruction, showing the presuppositions that are at work there, and then also underlining, as Rorty does, that the philosophers wished they didn't have to write. When they did write, they thought it was fixed. But because one can write and write again and write again, and even in the case of academic texts, is that there have been many articles written about Plato, Aristotle, Kant, covering some of the same things, then looking for new things, but also rehashing old things.
Right.
So the philosophy is never fixed for all time. It is interpreted, reinterpreted, rewritten, written again, and so on. This is Derrida's point.
Right. Of course.
So then if you treat philosophy as a kind of writing, as a kind of genre, then you're taking it out of the Platonic realm. It is here and now. And what was the terms that he used?
Which one?
I'm looking for that part. We're already within language.
Okay.
It's part of life. But there's no philosophy of language here. That's Rorty's point with Derrida.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think we will go ahead and end it there because I'm getting sleepy.
Okay.
And for next time, we'll go ahead and I think there's one or two other essays I would like to cover here. and then I'll see where we go from there.
All right.
Okay, so let's go ahead and end it here. Questions,
All right.
comments, concerns?
Maybe it would be good to do just like a brief summary of what we covered. I think that's usually good. That you usually do that at the end of these.
Okay, so we're covering Rorty's fleshing out of pragmatist themes, and he, again, because these essays were written in the early to late 70s, going into 1980, Heidegger definitely was still around. He died in 1976, but it wasn't until the late 70s when philosophers were really starting to take him seriously. Okay, so Heidegger, on the continental side, you could say, was one of Rorty's intellectual heroes to a certain point about where philosophy was going and overcoming the tradition, as the essay says. Certainly on the pragmatist side, John Dewey was Rorty's intellectual hero of doing away with abstract philosophizing and instead focusing on things like, really the thing about Dewey was that Dewey was so much more active in many different fields: education, politics, and things like that. Application of pragmatism in life. Certainly,
Right.
much farther than Peirce ever went, because Peirce confined himself still to science and to semiotics,
Right.
and James kind of being in the middle. But James was also focusing a little bit more on things like religious belief, the will to believe, the varieties of religious experience, and so on.
Right.
More to life.
Right.
So that was overcoming the tradition. Derrida also coming on the scene, philosophy as a kind of writing, deconstruction, all of that. And then how is it that pragmatists are unlike positivists? Positivism at the time still sort of alive and well within analytic philosophy.
Right.
Okay, so Rorty, again, fleshing out his pragmatist ideas, using other figures that have come onto the scene to further his own ideas.
Okay.
And become a pragmatist, or as others like to describe him later on, as a neo-pragmatist, because there was pragmatism. It kind of fell out of favor when it was ignored for some time until around the 60s or so, rediscovered.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, that was very interesting as always. And as always, thanks to everyone who watched this, and hopefully you enjoyed this as much as we did. And thanks to everyone for pressing the like button and sharing this video, and to those of you who subscribe to my channel, and especially to those of you who subscribe to my YouTube channel. I really appreciate that. Patreon/Mindgasms. And yeah, like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. And also, think about Rorty's thoughts on those subjects that we discussed, like relativism, writing, language, truth, and what he thinks about those thinkers like Heidegger, Derrida, and Dewey. And anything else to say before we end it there, Tim?
Yes, remember that Il n'y a pas de hors texte is not an ontological statement.
Yes. Yes. There is nothing outside of the text is not an ontological statement.
No.
All right. All right. Thanks again, and thanks everyone, and adios until next time.